I think it's important to start to distinguish
Mhm.
between fermented foods that have been cooked or heat processed, which can still be delicious, but what they don't have is live bacteria.
Right.
So, if you're interested in that sort of probiotic benefit of live fermented foods, well, then you need to really think about eating raw fermented foods that have not been heat processed or cooked. And then, in order to distinguish, you have to become a more savvy consumer. You have to read labels. You have to think about where you're finding it. If you're finding your sauerkraut in a can on a shelf without refrigeration in the middle of the supermarket, you can be pretty sure it's heat processed, because if it
Mhm.
was alive, it would be generating carbon dioxide and building up pressure in there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, certainly you can find commercially produced raw sauerkraut and kimchi, but you might have to look a little bit harder for them. And when you find them, they're likely to be in a refrigerated section, unless you're buying them from the person who made them and they're still in the unsealed vessel that they were fermented in.
This is an absolute honor. Thank you so, so much for being on this podcast. You are not only fantastic at what you do, you're a leader in your field of fermentation, but you're also absolutely freaking perfect for for where this podcast is at the moment. So basically, this podcast is all about health, and it's all about, what to eat, and, what the best kind of foods to eat. And do you know what? Fermentation and fermented products, fermented foods, they are so, so important to human health. And I couldn't think of anyone better than yourself, to be honest, to be on this podcast right now. So I just want to, first of all, say a huge, huge thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so happy to be here with you today. And
Great.
I always talk about fermentation.
I know, I know. So I have to tell you, I have been reading your books. So I've read Wild Fermentation and The Art of Fermentation. Now I know that Wild Fermentation, I think it's from 2003. Is that right?
Yeah. No, that was originally published in 2003. And then I revised it in
2000.
2006.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Um, Gosh, 2003, it was such a long time ago, and it absolutely exploded. And I can see why, because I've been reading it, and gosh, just the way that it's written and the way you speak about microbes and bacteria and just the beauty of fermentation, like it's so engaging, and I've never seen anyone talk about it in that way. So I just think it's such a beautifully written book. Did you write it yourself, like as in you wrote it, but did you have like editors heavily involved, or are they literally your words? Like,
Well, I mean, they're literally my words. But I mean, certainly I worked with an editor. I mean, there was some editing, but it was very light
yes.
editing. And I mean, the words are mine, and occasionally improved,
Yeah.
clarified, made more concise, by the sharp eyes of the editor.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I thought, because the way that it's written, it's just beautiful. And actually there's a line that I really loved, and I actually posted it on my Instagram not too long ago. It's about fermentation, and you basically said humans have been fermenting longer than we've been writing words, making pottery, or cultivating the soil. And I loved that so much, because it's so powerful, and it speaks about fermentation, and how important it is to our human, like the way that we're built, and like how our ancestors ate and how we should be eating today. It's just so, so powerful. So I had to post it on my Instagram. So thanks for that.
Nice, nice. Well, I mean, there is this whole interesting kind of speculative literature about how humans figured out fermentation
Mm.
and started fermenting. And sometimes people articulate it as, how did humans invent fermentation? How did humans create fermentation? And, fermentation is a natural phenomenon that far predates humanity. It far predates aerobic life on Earth. And, a biologist understands fermentation to be anaerobic metabolism, the production of energy without oxygen. And, using, this, biologist definition, well, the earliest forms of life on Earth were all fermenting organisms because they emerged before there was a significant amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. I think that really fermentation created us much more than we created fermentation. I mean, which is not to say that, human cultures obviously have, refined methods for fermentation. But the underlying biological processes, are much, much older than we are.
You know what? When you say that, that's just perfect, because I was watching a TED talk recently about a lady was presenting. She was absolutely fabulous. I wish I could remember her name right now, but she said that bacteria, that obviously they're ancient and they were here, long, long, long before we were. So it's almost like we're descendants of them. Like we are their descendants. Like bacteria rule. Like they outnumber us. They're in charge. Like so.
Well, we are their descendants, and they are an essential part of us, and they are an essential part of all multicellular forms of life. So, all animals, all plants, all of the different kinds of multicellular organisms are host to bacteria, which give us a certain amount of our functionality. In the case of our human bodies, we're just learning more and more about, how important bacteria are, not only to our digestive processes, but, to the system that we call our immune system. Every year there are new discoveries recognizing that bacteria play important roles in regulating biochemical processes in, all the systems of our bodies. Yes. We are these sort of like complex creations, but, we remain dependent upon the bacteria that are part of us.
Oh my gosh. So I can't wait to dig into everything that you just said. So that's all coming. But again, just once more, that's why I love your books, because you put so much focus on the bacteria. So you're not just a book that just talks about, oh, this is how you ferment, this is why it's good for you. You dive into the complexities and the beauty of like the world that we live in, and the bacteria is a massive part of that. So that's what I really loved about your books.
But I should just say that, for people who haven't seen my books, I definitely try to keep it accessible. Like my books are not written for microbiologists. I am not a microbiologist. I'm very much like a lay person who got interested in these foods and, started learning a certain amount about bacteria and other microorganisms as a result of my, interest in fermentation. But, the focus of my books really is, how to ferment things. And, my interest is making this accessible, because what I learned very early on is that a lot of people are intimidated by the idea of fermentation. And I remember the first time I taught a sauerkraut making workshop, which was in 1998, this young woman who was at the workshop, held up her jar of vegetables that we just shredded and salted. And she had this really worried look on her face. And she said, how can I be sure that I have good bacteria growing in this jar and not some dangerous bacteria that might, make me sick or kill somebody? So, because we've been taught to have so much anxiety about bacteria, it's very easy when you begin to ponder the idea of, food produced by bacteria and other microorganisms to project your anxiety about, the microorganisms onto the food, when in fact fermentation is a strategy for safety. As long as you understand the parameters of the conditions you are trying to create, there's no danger. Fermentation makes food safer. In the realm of the fermented vegetables that young woman 25 years ago was so concerned about, vegetables become much safer after you ferment them than they are beforehand. There's really, virtually no case history anywhere in the world of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables, because the inevitable acidification makes the environment extremely inhospitable to the kinds of organisms that sometimes are found on vegetables that could make people sick, like, E. coli or salmonella, or, other organisms that we would associate with food poisoning and illness. And, it's just very convenient for us that, the organisms that make us sick can't survive in an acidic environment. So processes that, encourage acidifying bacteria make food safer.
Fabulous. And not to mention fermentation makes it not only safer, but also more nutritious and more delicious. So all the more reason for people to start including more fermented foods in their diet. But before we get into all of the nitty gritty, you literally just covered most of my questions. So I'm going to have to rein it in a bit. It's all good. It's all good. So when it comes to yourself, obviously we know a lot about you already. But I just wanted to know what made you get into such a niche thing, like fermentation. There's not many of you out there. So what made you really get into it? I know the story, but if you could explain it for everyone, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So, it was the confluence of a number of things over time. So, first of all, I'll say that as a kid growing up in New York City, I loved pickles. And, my grandparents were all immigrants from Eastern Europe. The kinds of pickles that we were eating are not the vinegary pickles that fill contemporary supermarket shelves, but they were the, fermented cucumbers, the Eastern European style pickles that are abundantly available in New York City where I grew up. And, I wasn't asking questions about how they were made. I wasn't watching my grandmother make them or anything like that. We were buying them from a delicatessen, but I loved that flavor, which I now recognize as the flavor of lactic acid from fermentation. So, that's the first stage of my evolving interest. The second stage is that in my mid-20s, I spent a few years following a macrobiotic diet, and macrobiotics places an emphasis on the digestive benefit of pickles and other live fermented foods. And, I started eating fermented foods as more of a health practice during this period. And I noticed that these pickles that I'd been eating my entire life, whenever I would take a bite out of one, or even just smell it, or even right now just thinking about it, I would feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And I began to associate live fermented foods with getting my digestive juices flowing, and really started incorporating that as a health practice. But as long as I lived in New York, I was buying them. They were abundantly available. I had a tiny kitchen, etc. But in 1993, I moved from New York City to rural Tennessee. And among the many changes in my life at that time, I got involved in gardening. And the first year that I was gardening, I was just such a naive city kid. I'd never really thought about cycles of agricultural production. And it came as a little bit of a surprise to me that, our entire row of cabbages was ready at about the same time. And so, I'd never made sauerkraut, but I knew that sauerkraut had something to do with preserving cabbage, and I knew that it was delicious and that I loved the flavor of it. So, I looked in this, we have this all around cookbook that you're likely to find in most kitchens in the United States called The Joy of Cooking. Yes. So I looked in The Joy of Cooking, and I found a recipe for how to make sauerkraut, and I couldn't believe how simple it was. And I shredded cabbage, and I added salt, and I added some seasonings, and it was delicious. I couldn't believe how easy it was. I'm everything about it. But then I just started experimenting. What if you use turnips instead of cabbage? What if you mix some different vegetables together? What about these seasonings? And then I kind of branched out, and I learned how to make yogurt, and I learned how to make a country wine. And before long, it sort of I went down the rabbit hole, and it became a full-fledged obsession. And, that was around 1993. So that was 30 years ago. And, you'll still find on my kitchen counter, all kinds of fermentation projects. And, I experiment a lot. There's an infinity of ways you can ferment things. Really, human cultures in every part of the world have, developed, different techniques for fermentation. And, I find almost all of it to be incredibly delicious.
Mm.
And the other thing is, it's all very accessible. Like, none of it is rocket science. You don't need a laboratory, you don't need a lot of special equipment. Most fermentation, you can just do in very, very simple, straightforward ways from, your kitchen, whatever that might be like.
So when people think of fermentation, they think of sauerkraut, they think of kimchi, kombucha, but what is the full range of fermented foods that are available out there? I mean, can you ferment anything, or would you say there's only specific things like yogurt and cheese? Like, what is the scope of fermentation?
I mean, I would say anything you could possibly eat can be fermented in a range of ways. And I would say, most people in most parts of the world eat and drink products of fermentation every single day. So fermentation, certainly people with sort of, ideas about diet and nutrition are seeking out fermentation, but you don't have to have ideas about diet and nutrition to eat fermented foods, and almost everybody does. Bread is fermented, cheese is fermented, cured meats are fermented, most of our condiments are fermented.
Yeah.
You mentioned sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, almost all cheeses. I mean, dairy is an interesting case because, until widespread refrigeration in the 20th century, dairy was almost always fermented. People milking cows or goats might get a chance to drink fresh milk, but if you don't have a refrigerator, there's no way to keep milk fresh. And so, raw milk will just spontaneously acidify. And that gives rise to everything from yogurt to kefir to many styles of cheeses. Sometimes people are surprised to hear that meat is fermented, but there's all different ways of fermenting meat. And if you've ever eaten salami, in salami production, they add starter cultures. And, the first day of the fermentation, they keep it pretty warm to get rapid acidification. In certain kinds of cured meats, let's say hams rather than salamis, the fermentation maybe is more incidental. It's not like a critical part of how the meat is preserved. And yet that incidental fermentation contributes a lot of the, very specific flavors that arise in different styles of ham. So, absolutely. Like any food you could possibly imagine can be fermented. Coffee is fermented, chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented. There's just an incredible range of foods and beverages that are fermented.
Wow, that's good to know. And it's good for people to kind of, after this episode, to become familiar with the benefits of fermentation, and to then, keep your eyes peeled for properly fermented foods that you can buy, because they are more nutritious and they are safer to eat. I mean, you said that the reason why they're safer to eat is because they contain lactic acid, which basically lowers the pH and makes it difficult for pathogenic bacteria to actually grow.
So actually, to give a very vivid illustration of this,
yes, please.
There's been a lot of study, this has to do with infants and weaning infants, off of their mother's milk, onto solid food. But there's been a lot of studies that have affirmed that, okay, the universal weaning food is like porridge. Of whatever grain. But there's a lot of work documenting that in places where people are feeding their infants fermented porridges, you have much higher survival of the infants than places where people are serving the infants non-fermented porridge. And part of this is that the acidification prevents the possibility of Clostridium difficile or other kinds of bacterial infections that can give infants diarrhea. That could lead to further illness and sometimes death. And also the improved nutrient bioavailability of porridges that have been fermented. And so, the most baseline benefit that we get from fermented foods is this idea of pre-digestion, this idea that nutrients are broken down into more accessible forms before we eat them. So, protein-rich food, like let's say a soybean, you never really hear about people sitting down and eating a big bowl of soybeans for dinner, because soybeans are like our human digestive systems cannot access the protein in soybeans. And this was recognized thousands of years ago by the Asian cultures that developed soybean agriculture, and then they developed different ways of fermenting the soybeans, which has the effect of breaking down the proteins into amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and makes the nutrient of the soybean much more accessible to our digestive systems. Any kind of grain, the minerals are tied up in these chemical bonds that our digestion can't break down. But if you ferment the grains first before you eat them, whether that's sourdough bread or dosas, a South Indian style pancake, or injera, an Ethiopian style pancake, but any kind of fermented grain, what's going to happen is that those chemical bonds binding the minerals get broken down, and the minerals become more accessible. So these are examples of pre-digestion, which is the first benefit of fermented foods, would be this sort of increased nutrient bioavailability.
That's so fascinating, because I was having a fantastic conversation with Dr. Bill Schindler, and he was talking about how plants, they have a natural defense mechanism. So they don't really want to be eaten. They want to like defend themselves, like seeds and grains, and even some vegetables like oxalates. They have got these chemicals that like to protect the plant and like to kind of cause harm to the person who's actually eating it, especially in large doses. So it's very interesting, very fascinating take on the topic. And it's interesting because if the plant is trying to defend itself, what fermentation actually does is it actually breaks down those defenses, and it allows the nutrition to flow out. It breaks down, the phytates and from the grains and the oxalates from the plants, and it actually helps. It helps with digestion. It makes it more nutritious. So I find that fascinating too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then, one of the reasons why there's so much, renewed interest in fermentation, and I would say that fermented foods and beverages have enjoyed enduring popularity, and you don't have to be thinking about fermentation to enjoy them. And yes, Lord knows people have enjoyed all kinds of fermented foods and beverages without thinking about the process. But what's made people start thinking about the process, I think, and I had extraordinarily good timing with my first book, Wild Fermentation, because it came out just a couple of years after the Human Microbiome Project. And after, really, I would say for the entirety of the 20th century, the only context in which we were thinking about bacteria was protecting ourselves from disease. So in
the bad bacteria,
popular consciousness, bacteria were equated with danger, disease, and death.
Absolutely.
And then beginning, I would say, with the Human Microbiome Project, but for some people it goes much further back than that. And certainly the word probiotics was being thrown around before the new millennium. But with the Human Microbiome Project, we began to recognize just how important bacteria are to our bodies, our well-being, our functionality. And also began to document the fact that biodiversity in our microbiome is diminishing due to all of these factors in our modern lives. Chemical exposure, whether it's antibiotic drugs, antibacterial cleansing products, chlorine in water, agricultural chemicals, microplastics, all this chemical exposure that we have. Some of it is inhibiting certain bacteria in our gut, so it's narrowing the range of bacteria that are growing, the biodiversity, and also our diets, because it's out that, one of the most important nutrients for the bacteria, especially in the far reaches of our intestines, is fiber. And, with all of this, kind of processed food and, less starchy tubers in our diets than our distant ancestors had, we're just eating less fiber, almost everyone. And so that's further diminishing the bacteria in our gut. So, as people started thinking about gut bacteria as an important part of our health and well-being, well, these biodiverse, bacteria-rich fermented foods, suddenly, we're not only delicious, we're not only practical for their stability, but, sort of became ways to improve biodiversity of the gut. So, a lot of people are seeking out live fermented foods with the bacteria intact in order to try to improve biodiversity in the gut, which can potentially improve digestion, improve overall immune function. There's even some new evidence suggesting that it can improve mental health. But anyway, I think it's important to start to distinguish between fermented foods that have been cooked or heat processed, which can still be delicious, which can still be practical in certain ways, which still can have the benefit of pre-digestion and making certain nutrients more bioavailable, but what they don't have is live bacteria.
Right.
So, if you're interested in that sort of probiotic benefit of live fermented foods, well, then you need to really think about eating raw fermented foods that have not been heat processed or cooked. And then, in order to distinguish, you have to become a more savvy consumer. You have to read labels. You have to think about where you're finding it. If you're finding your sauerkraut in a can on a shelf without refrigeration in the middle of the supermarket, you can be pretty sure it's heat processed, because if it was alive, it would be generating carbon dioxide and building up pressure in there. So, certainly you can find commercially produced raw sauerkraut and kimchi, but you might have to look a little bit harder for them. And when you find them, they're likely to be in a refrigerated section, unless you're buying them from the person who made them and they're still in the unsealed vessel that they were fermented in. Which is sort of the old world way. When I was a kid in New York in the 60s, you could still buy pickles that way. You'd go to the delicatessen, there'd be a big barrel, and you'd say like, oh, give me a this size jar of pickles, and they would just take it from the barrel and put it in the jar. These days that gets harder to find, and mostly finding prepackaged things. But certainly, in the US, in the UK, in many parts of the world, you can find, unpasteurized raw versions of fermented foods, but sometimes you have to look in more sort of specialty or niche kinds of places.
Right. And at the end of this conversation, towards the end, I told you before the conversation, but I have a jar of kimchi that I'd like to ask you about. So we'll save that for the end, because obviously reading labels is a really key part of this. But I just wanted to kind of paraphrase and talk about what you've just spoken about, because I think it's really powerful and I think people really need to get this. So I'm just going to take it all the way back to basically early man and just how we're built. We are covered in bacteria. We have trillions of bacteria in our gut. Now, that is trillions. That is like, it outnumbers our cells. I think in one of your books, it says by 10, like 10 times our cells. Approximate, like obviously we don't know for sure. But basically, but early man, and even 200 years ago, we didn't even think about it. It was just, we couldn't see them and no one could check it out for themselves. So the bacteria were just doing their thing, like symbiotic relationship. They were helping us, we were helping them. But then as far as my understanding goes, a couple of things happened that I think kind of disturbed this relationship between us and bacteria. And that is two things. First thing, when the germ theory came into practice. So when the germ theory came out, that basically said, they started looking through microscopes and they started to see bacteria for the first time. I think this was like 150 years ago or something around that kind of time. And they were sort of looking at bacteria and they were starting to make connections between bad bacteria and disease. So that's what kind of started off this.
I just want to interrupt
go
you
on, interject anytime. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know enough to say some bacteria are bad and some are good.
Yeah,
some can be pathogenic to us.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're bad. I mean, some that we have found are pathogenic to us also have an important function in our bodies. So maybe it depends on other factors whether they become pathogenic. But anyway,
I love it. No, I love it. You're saying
bacteria.
Basically, you're saying don't judge. That's what you're saying. You're saying don't judge the bacteria. I like that. So the germ theory came into place. That's what made people kind of become afraid of the term germs, bacteria, microbes. Like that's basically what started. But then the second thing is refrigeration, because refrigeration took away the necessity to ferment foods. I had a great conversation. Dr. Terry Walls, she said something fab, and she said that 100 years ago, when refrigeration was created, that was to the detriment of our health, basically, because now we don't need to ferment our foods anymore. We can just refrigerate. And I think those two things created this fear, like you said, around bacteria. People started cooking, pasteurizing, as you said, and raw dairy, for example, is a big no-no for the majority of people because they think that the bacteria in there is dangerous for them. Which I've learned enough from this podcast to know now that raw dairy is highly nutritious, and it's a fabulous form of nutrition and food.
But it also, I mean, for cows to be healthy, they need access to pasture. In big countries like the UK and the US, most of the cows don't have access to pasture, and so there's no way that they can be healthy. And so, I mean, pasteurization makes a lot of sense as a salvage protocol for milk of animals that are not healthy.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Like the rawness isn't the problem; it's sort of the qualitative aspects of how we're raising our animals.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge problem with the farming methods these days. I mean, that's a whole conversation in itself.
And the farming methods, to some degree, are dictated by the density of our populations. But I don't disagree with your point.
Yeah. So I'll continue. Where are we? Okay, so basically that's where we're at. And now fermented products are kind of like a thing that people have sometimes, like every now and again. Like I remember growing up, sauerkraut was probably the only truly fermented kind of food that I was having. And even then it was like a bit here and there.
Probably having cheese all the time, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Probably bread. You probably were eating vinegar. I mean, you would be the rare person if you, in most of your life, were not eating fermented foods every day. It's just, it would take an extraordinary discipline to completely avoid them because they're just so ubiquitous.
Okay, so
you might not have been eating sauerkraut, but you were eating all these other products of fermentation.
Right. So to reframe that, I never considered fermented foods. And the only time I did consider it was when I had a jar of sauerkraut, for example. But things are changing, as you said. It's becoming trendy, like it's becoming more fashionable now, especially with like kombucha and kefir. Like they're definitely going up in the ranks now, and it's becoming more. Now we're learning more about the gut microbiome, and we're learning about how important it is for our health. And we're starting to see why fermented foods was a good idea in the first place. So that's the story, right? Have I got that right, kind of in your mind?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And then, so, okay, this experience you're talking about of like, people thinking like, sauerkraut is fermented food. I can't tell you how many times I've had the experience where I meet some like stranger somewhere out of, I'm not like teaching a fermentation workshop. I'm at my friend's party or something. I meet a friend of a friend. What do you do? Oh, I write and teach about fermentation. And then I have people make these terrible faces because if they're, when they think of fermentation, they're thinking of sauerkraut or kimchi,
Mhm.
or maybe like the stinkiest cheese they ever tried, or something like that. And so they're thinking that fermentation is really extreme. I mean, which it absolutely can be, but it's also every day. I mean, your most basic foods like, bread and cheese, beer and wine, chocolate and vanilla, they're all produced by fermentation. And it's just,
Mhm.
all of our condiments, whether it's like the ancient condiments like fish sauce and soy sauce,
Mm.
those are definitely fermented. Right now I'm straining out soy sauce that's been fermenting for almost a year and a half, on my counter. And it just smells so good. I wish I could like share the smell with
Do you know what?
and your
That's really
listeners.
interesting that you say that, because I was reading recently about the soy sauce scandal, about how the soy sauce sold in China, like some brands, they're not fermenting their soy sauce; they're just
I don't
adding
think I'll be limited
vinegar
to
and
China. I'm pretty sure in the UK or in the US, you could find, cheap soy sauce that
yeah.
time is money. And these
Hmm.
take a
They
lot of
can't afford a
time,
year, six
would
months,
cost a lot of money.
Mm.
So industry has found shortcuts to replicate these foods. But anyway, condiments, the ancient condiments are all fermented, but then
Mhm.
the modern condiments all rely upon vinegar, which is
Mm.
a product of fermentation, to stabilize them. So mustard and mayonnaise and ketchup and chutneys and salsas, all of these rely upon vinegar, which is a very important product of fermentation. Vinegar is always made from alcohol, so either from wine or from beer or from sake or other forms of alcohol. There's little organisms called acetobacter that will consume alcohol and transform it into acetic acid.
So can I just ask
Um,
you a question then?
so
Can I just
but
ask you a
fermentation
question?
is just like a building block of flavor. Like I
Mm.
don't think there's a restaurant anywhere in the world that's not working with fermentation as part of the food that they're preparing,
So
even really terrible restaurants.
can I just ask then, because you mentioned that bread is fermented, chocolate and coffee, but is the distinction between that and having as really good for your gut health live cultures? So you say that bread and coffee and chocolate and all of those things, that we're having them daily, but the fact that they're not live cultures, is that what kind of separates them from kimchi and sauerkraut, which are kind of considered like health foods, like superfoods?
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
okay,
well,
I understand now. Yeah.
there's a lot of different kinds of bread, to be
Mm.
sure, but it's all cooked. And so
Mm.
if you want to eat sourdough dough raw, it's teeming with live bacteria, but who wants to eat raw dough? It, it, it just
Cookie
tastes
dough,
terrible.
maybe. I mean, if you're having a little kind of cheat day, maybe. But I'm glad you clarified that. Yeah.
But the thing about bread is that pre-digestion. We
Mm.
think of bread as the packet of yeast that you buy it at any store and put in. Yeast was never like a separate thing until the 20th century. Like yeast is present on anything that yeast can ferment. Yeast is present on grapes. Yeast is present on wheat. Yeast is present on rye. Yeast is present on apples.
Mm.
The yeast was just derived from the thing that was being fermented, but the yeast was never alone. And this is a really important aspect of fermentation, is like, today you can buy pure culture starters, whether it's yeast to make bread or to make wine, or whether it's a specific bacteria for making yogurt. There's all kinds of pure culture starters that it's possible to buy, but that's really a departure from the history of fermentation, because all bread until the 20th century was made with the community of organisms found on wheat or on rye, and that includes bacteria, and the bacteria are really critical. So for instance, with this whole epidemic of gluten intolerance, it happens that the bacteria that are involved in a sourdough starter digest gluten. So you have much lower levels of gluten in a well-fermented sourdough loaf than you do in a 2-hour yeast risen loaf, which is most of what's commercially available. So the pre-digestion can still be extremely significant in terms of how the food makes your body feel. Same with lactose intolerance. Like, the bacteria involved in making yogurt are eating is lactose. Now, it happens that in the United States, where I live, your typical commercial yogurt is fermented for about 2.5 hours, which is the minimum time necessary to get it to set. But the presumption in this country is that people want their yogurt as little sour as possible. And usually people put lots of sugar in so that they don't experience the sourness. Whereas most of the traditional yogurt cultures, they like the sourness. They ferment the milk longer to enhance the sourness. What that also means is that the yogurt has much less lactose pre-digestion, because it's the lactose that's turning into lactic acid. And so, it's like you use yogurt to celebrate that sour flavor, rather than adding a lot of sugar to try to cover it up. So even fermented foods that end up getting cooked can be, can be improved nutritionally by virtue of the fermentation.
Yeah, because it's been broken down before the actual cooking process.
And then there's this whole other area that we haven't even talked about yet, which is fermentation generates all of these metabolic byproducts, some of which have extremely important benefits. So, you take something like a jar of sauerkraut, and there's this compound in it that's not found in the original vegetables, isothiocyanates, that are regarded as anti-carcinogenic. And that is a metabolic byproduct of the fermentation process. There's a Japanese soybean ferment called natto. It's just whole fermented soybeans, but the fermentation not only generates vitamin K2, this is the food with the highest known levels of vitamin K2, but it has this compound called nattokinase, which has been found to dissolve the fibers that sometimes build up inside people's blood vessels, constricting circulation, called fibrin. So the nattokinase can dissolve fibrin and improve people's circulation. So lots of different fermented foods and beverages have these metabolic byproducts that have specific beneficial qualities for us. So that's distinct from the bacteria themselves, and also distinct from the pre-digestion.
Right. And also what I wanted to add to that is, before people kind of think to themselves, oh, okay, so chocolate's fermented and bread is fermented. Let's do good for our health, and let's start eating all the bread and all the chocolate, and we're getting all the fermented goodness from it.
Well, don't forget, beer is fermented too.
Beer, absolutely.
You don't necessarily, the more beers you drink, the healthier you don't necessarily become.
Yeah, exactly. But what I wanted to I suppose then, when it comes to the rest of this, the rest of this conversation, is I want to focus on the foods that actually have the live bacteria, because I think that's what, in light of what we were discussing beforehand about how our guts are so less diverse than they were, and also the Western people who are eating a Westernized diet, we typically have less diversity than people, living in kind of tribal communities, and their diversity is so is huge in comparison to ours, and that could be why we're not doing so well, like health-wise, because our gut is just not diverse anymore. So the best remedy for that is to actually add in more live bacteria. There's this really interesting,
and also to eat a more diverse diet.
Like absolutely, to feed the bacteria to kind of help them grow. But there's this really interesting kind of study. Now, I don't know it off by heart. This is kind of like I'm just kind of recalling it off the top of my head. But taking probiotic pills, like supplements, did good for people. But as soon as they stopped, their gut bacteria, I think it was like after a few months, their gut bacteria went straight back to like the original diversity of their diet. But then when they tested another group, apparently with fermented foods with live cultures in them, they maintained the gut diversity for longer than the period that it was studied. So basically, they got more benefit and longer benefits than people who just took probiotic pills. Do you have any comments on that? Anything you'd like to say about supplements or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm first of all, I'm not a clinician. I mean, I'm not going to like say that like taking probiotic supplements is bad, or even that eating live fermented foods is better. Although, that's my gut feeling about it.
No pun intended.
But I actually did see a news article about a study probably 3 or 4 months ago, and I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but it was actually arguing that probiotic capsules could be counterproductive. Because you generally, each one, the market, like each capsule contains 3 billion cells. But usually what that means is 3 billion copies of a single cell, which doesn't really do much to improve biodiversity, whereas all traditional fermented foods involve a community of organisms, and it might be a community of just a handful, or it might be an extremely complex community that's uncountable. But generally they have much greater biodiversity. But anyway, this study found that probiotics can sometimes be counterproductive. Rather than improving biodiversity, it can encourage that one strain that you're taking billions and billions of cells of to become more dominant and sometimes push out some of the biodiversity. So, I mean, I don't know the ultimate answer. I mean, I have a feeling in the coming decades, probably a lot of the medical advances that we'll be reading about will be very targeted probiotic therapies. I don't want to, badmouth the idea of probiotic therapy at all. However, if your objective is restoring biodiversity in the gut, I would think that fermented foods are a more straightforward way of doing that.
Yeah, and I think we could all benefit from it. So we could all benefit from having
there's
extra bacteria.
There's no risk to it either. These are just, sort of, foods that have been, part of different human cultural traditions forever. And, and I think it's good to eat a variety of them. I mean, in front of me, I have a jar of sauerkraut, which is, shredded salted vegetables. This is the simplest method. Like all you do is you shred vegetables, whatever they might be, lightly salt them and then toss them around with the salt, and then maybe get involved and squeeze them or pound them a little bit. And as you squeeze or pound them, while the salt is drawing water out of them by osmosis, they'll get nice and juicy. And once they're juicy, then you just pack them into a vessel. It can be, as simple as a small jar, or it could be some big ceramic crock or a barrel or even a plastic bucket. And you just sort of push down and get rid of the air pockets. And make sure the vegetables get submerged under their own juices, and if possible, put some sort of little weight on to make sure you keep them submerged. And then every single time, the lactic acid bacteria, which are always present on the bacteria, you don't need to introduce them. I mean, they're always present on the vegetables. They will dominate and begin to acidify it, within hours. And then, in terms of the $1,000,000 question with fermentation is always, how long do you ferment it? And there's no straightforward answer. If you're, in a warmer place, the process will go faster. If you're in a cooler environment, the process will go more slowly. But in any case, the acidity is going to build over time. And the only way you can know when it's ready is by tasting it. And we won't all consider ready to be the same point. And this is one of the great things about making these things yourself is, you can make them to suit your taste, or, to please your children or your partner or whomever, but you have more control over the process and what the flavor is eventually like in terms of sourness. And then you can control it in other ways too. How much salt do you add? That's highly subjective. Do you like your food very salty? Are you trying to have a salt moderated diet? You can control that when you do it yourself. Do you like spicy food? Do you like other kinds of seasonings? You can add the seasonings you like. And then over time, you can have a variety of things. So like I have a jar of Chinese style pao cai that's just got a very different seasoning and this perpetual brine that I use over and over again. And periodically I add salt and seasonings to it, but then I put different vegetables in. Right now there's some slices of turnips in it. You can also brine any kind of a whole vegetable or large vegetables. I have a jar in front of me that's pickles, the kind of pickles that got me interested in fermentation. This is just, cucumbers, salt, water, dill, garlic, and grape leaves. And this has been in my refrigerator. I only, in the summer heat where I live in Tennessee, I only ferment it for maybe like 5 days or so. And then I have to get it in the refrigerator. Not that it would become dangerous to eat, but because the pickles could become soft and mushy and unappealing. So, I give it a relatively short fermentation and then put it in the refrigerator. If I was in a place like London, I probably would give it a longer fermentation because the milder temperatures there, it would take longer for the lactic acid bacteria to develop. And also those enzymes that could make the vegetables get soft and mushy would take much longer to develop. And then, of course, like I love the Korean style.
Anyone listening, this is a huge jar.
This is a gallon-sized
Kimchi.
jar of Napa cabbage kimchi.
That is a big jar of kimchi.
But you can ferment any vegetables, and that's what I recommend is the place to start. Just because it's so straightforward. To the degree that people might be projecting anxiety onto the process, it's as safe as food gets, fermented vegetables. So that's a great place to start, but that doesn't have to be the end point. I mean, like the world of fermentation is just vast. And, for anyone who gets interested, there are just, in every culinary tradition of the world, there are, distinctive styles of fermentation. And I wouldn't write off, light alcoholic beverages. If you did let's say you pressed apples into apple cider, that's going to spontaneously begin to ferment. And, those yeasts will be, consuming sugars and turning them into alcohol. But there's also lactic acid bacteria. If you drink that in the first couple of weeks, the alcohol will be really quite light. And there'll be all these other, bacteria in it. And, like you mentioned, kombucha and water kefir. I mean, lightly fermented beverages are, a feature of life in a lot of different places. One that I have in my refrigerator right now that I love to make is a Caribbean beverage called mabi, and it's made from the bark of a tree with the same name, mabi, and it's a bittersweet beverage. I mean, you certainly add sugar if you're someone who's trying to not consume sugar. Like mabi would not be the beverage for you. I mean, all the lightly fermented beverages, what's fermenting is primarily sugar. Mabi is just incredibly wonderful. I learned about it from people from Puerto Rico. There's an infinity of fermentation process. In Mexico, a lot of people make this lovely pineapple-based light beverage called tepache, and they use the skin of the pineapple. You know how when you eat a pineapple, you can never get all of the delicious flesh away from the skin. So
Right.
discard the skin, there's always flesh on it as well.
Yes, yeah.
So in Mexico, a lot of families, make tepache, which is a lightly fermented beverage. So basically, they make a sugar water solution, put those vinegar, put those pineapple skins in it. The pineapple flesh, the flavor of the pineapple infuses into the liquid, but then also the yeast that's on the outside of the pineapple begins to ferment the sugar, and it begins to get bubbly and active. And then really, if you set up the same thing but leave it out longer, exposed to oxygen, it'll become vinegar. So a lot of people in Mexico make both tepache, a lightly fermented beverage, and their own pineapple vinegar.
Gosh, the way you speak about it just makes it sound so easy if someone wanted to get started
Well,
on their own.
it is.
Yeah, totally. What I wanted to basically mention is, first of all, the Koreans. So I can't have a conversation about fermentation and fermented products without talking about kimchi and how the Koreans are just known for being so healthy as a westernized country. So that is largely down to who knows, but it could be down to the sheer amount of kimchi that they actually eat. I mean, I think they have like 25, I talk in kilos, because
I can see kilos. I can understand
20 about 25 kilos per year on average. And
my understanding is that most people in South Korea are eating kimchi with every meal.
Every meal, yeah. I've seen programs on it, and there's this really interesting story about how a Korean, I think she was a scientist, and she basically took some families and they would make kimchi themselves because they use their hands, like they get stuck in with their hands. And apparently through analysis afterwards, she could tell which family made which kimchi because the bacteria from their hands became part of the food. So she could kind of see it. And that was so fascinating, like how bacteria works. But it's so healthy, and it could be the reason why they're doing so well in terms of health. But
and I think that it's thoroughly ingrained in the Korean culinary culture to eat kimchi with every meal. And I think a lot of times when I meet Western people who are interested in the benefits of fermentation, the big block that they have is like, but I don't know how to eat it. I don't know what to eat it with. And I would recommend people to think about fermented vegetables as a condiment. When you make a sandwich, I'm sure everyone who's had sauerkraut has had some kind of a sandwich, whether it's like a hot dog on a bun or a Reuben sandwich or something. I mean, sauerkraut is great on a sandwich.
Really great, yeah.
But I mean, it can be a condiment with anything. Like if I have eggs in the morning, I'll have a little bit of sauerkraut or kimchi with it. It's very versatile. It doesn't just go with one kind of thing, but then also if you have a range of different kinds of fermented vegetables, like what I just was talking about, then depending on the flavor or the theme of the meal that you're putting together, you could think like, oh, the sauerkraut would go better with that than the kimchi, or the kimchi would be better than the sauerkraut, or the outside would go back. I mean, there's different styles of it, but what they all have in common is probiotics. But if you're making them yourselves, each batch is going to have because I'm working with different vegetables in each one, they're all going to have different communities of bacteria. So when I vary it up, I'm actually enhancing the biodiversity.
And the more diverse, the better. That's the key.
Yeah.
I actually like to stir my kimchi into like my rice and into, if I'm having some quinoa, to kind of give it some kind of spice and bit of edge. I like to add like vinegary, like sauerkraut into like sauces and things. It just adds a really nice depth to the flavor. But I suppose this leads me to two more questions. The first one is, when it comes to how much people should be having. Now, I know you're probably sick of this question, but would you say just the more, the better daily? Or would you say, oh, you don't need to have too much, like a tablespoon a day or something? I know it's not dose. I know that it's not a supplement, it's food. But what are your thoughts?
I would say much more important than how much you eat is eating it frequently. So I think, sure, if you had like a tablespoon with every meal, that would be amazing. But you have to find what works for you. And I mean, I just don't know enough, to make blanket recommendations to everybody. There might be certain preconditions, like certain people with certain thyroid problems need to stay away from cruciferous vegetables, which can exacerbate their symptoms. So, then you'd probably want to stay away from sauerkraut, but there's all kinds of ways you can ferment other kinds of vegetables that are not cruciferous vegetables. So, that person needs to, be fermenting, carrots and onions and, just other kinds of vegetables that aren't cabbages. So, I hesitate to make just like blanket recommendations. I mean, I don't specifically think that it would be possible for you to have too much, except that generally fermented vegetables have salt, and sometimes they're very salty. And for me, that's a limiting factor because, I'm trying to be fairly moderate about my salt intake. So, I like to make really low salt versions of things. I don't have to worry about that, and I can eat as much as I want. But, even just from a flavor standpoint, the saltier they are, the smaller the amount I'm interested in eating.
So this is a final question. If I was to want to have as like live food as possible, let's say kimchi. So basically, I've got my kimchi here. For anybody watching, you'll see it. If anyone listening, I've got my kimchi here. And I'm really happy with it, but I just want to run some things by you. So first of all, I did find it in the refrigerated section. So that's a good sign, right? Anybody who wants as live food as possible in the fridge. Okay. So it just says dairy and vinegar free. So I suppose vinegar
is on the top. Look at the top. Look at the top. It says raw.
Like that. Raw, yes. Yes. It says raw.
It says raw, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Raw is the most important thing that you're looking for in terms of live culture foods. Now, vinegar is really never in sauerkraut or kimchi. I mean,
it's usually in pickles, right?
Because I mean, it's not that. Well, okay, pickles is a confusing word for people. So a pickle is anything preserved in an acidic medium. Sauerkraut is a pickle and kimchi is a pickle. But what fills contemporary supermarket shelves is basically vegetables or other things. In the southern United States where I live, you'll find a lot of like pickled hard-boiled eggs. You might find pickled pig's feet. So it's not just vegetables.
I see.
I understand. Other things to pickle.
Yeah.
But let's say I walked into the supermarket and I go to look for pickles. In the middle of the supermarket, I'm going to find this big section with all of these sort of heat processed bottles.
That's right.
Sort of a hot vinegar solution poured over some cucumbers. And I mean, those can be delicious. I see what's so practical about them, why supermarkets love them. Those really became widespread outside of the wine producing regions of the world in the middle of the 20th century when the process was developed for distilled white vinegar, the vinegar that's cheaper than water. But in most places, historically, vinegar, which is made from alcohol, which is made from sugars, has just been fairly precious. And so, once this process was developed at the same time as, sort of supermarkets were emerging as a big force in the world, those kinds of pickles became very dominant compared to the older world pickles, like the Eastern European style pickles that I grew up with, people from the Middle East, people from Central Asia, people from East Asia, people in a lot of different parts of the world have these elaborate pickling traditions that, historically always were done by fermentation in a salty environment, but sometimes now that is being replaced for reasons of convenience by vinegary versions of those things. Nothing's wrong with vinegar, but like typically these foods have been produced with lactic acid rather than acetic acid. It's a different kind of a flavor. Chemically, it's a different acid. But they both can potentially help preserve food.
Yeah, so the ones that you find on the shelf that aren't refrigerated, and they are delicious and they're still great, but they don't pack the probiotic punch. So if you're looking for probiotics, I think one of the key things to finally wrap it up, one of the key things I've seen on this label, it says it's unpasteurized, which means it hasn't been heated, and it's loaded with live enzymes and living food. So this I'd say this is a really good pot of kimchi, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
And honestly, there's a lot less pasteurization of kimchi in the world than there is of sauerkraut.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure I could explain to you the because, but it's just a reality. But more and more you can find living sauerkraut if you look for it. But then sometimes people are put off by the price, and basically like the manufacturers gotta like refrigerate it once it's in a jar, and then the retailer has to keep it refrigerated, which is an expense. And so sometimes people are put off by the price of the sort of real unpasteurized product. And that's where I come in, just to say like, okay, you don't need to spend $12 for a little jar of fermented vegetables. You can make it yourself. Like there's probably like $1.50 or $2 worth of vegetables in that jar, and if you do the process, then you can enjoy that jar without spending all that money. So I want to encourage people who are interested in trying to learn how to make their own sauerkraut, kimchi, other kinds of fermented vegetables, other kinds of fermented foods, to give it a try. And obviously I think that my books are the best place to find information, but there's plenty of information out there on the World Wide Web. If you check out my website, wildfermentation.com, I have links to all kinds of fermentation related resources, along with information about my books and my workshops. But there's no shortage of information out there, and just don't be afraid. Like that, I would say that's the biggest stumbling block for a lot of people is, they're afraid of making a mistake that might make somebody sick, and just don't be afraid. This is just not so hard. What I described earlier, like shredding vegetables, salting them, squeezing them, pounding them, getting them juicy, stuffing them in the jar. That's the whole thing. It's important to be clean hands, clean tools, clean vessels. Don't get yourself all worked up about sterilization and buying lots of chemicals to sterilize everything. Completely unnecessary. These processes themselves are the safety.
Love it. Oh, that was a perfect wrap up for such a fantastic conversation. I feel like I learned a ton, so I'm sure anybody listening feels the same. Thank you so much for your time. It was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, and I do hope that we can do this again sometime.